I don't get people who do 100% headshots all the time. Can I get a yearly subscription to that aimbot?
Well, it's like basketball players that get three points all the time.
I don't get why people hack in games. Like it's a question that I've been meaning to ask a hacker if I meet one. Like, why do you hack? Like, what fun do you get out of it? I mean, you know that victory is not yours. You only got the victory because you were getting help from some lines of code.
So it's funny, in the era before online games, right? There used to be like games magazines dedicated to like just cheat codes for video games. You know, like
Yeah, but
the games were offline back then.
exactly, but like
yeah.
that's not affecting anyone else.
Yeah.
It's like the harm principle.
Yeah.
Mill's harm principle. Like
Yeah.
as long as your actions are only affecting you, you're about to operate within that sphere of liberty. The moment you start doing actions that affect others, that is when your liberty ends.
I've never heard the harm principle applied to video game. That's like a very
well,
novel.
we do live in a modern.
It's a very novel use for the harm principle. Although to be honest, like people have forgot the very high boundary for limiting freedom of speech. Parties like the BJP just want to limit everything that's critical of them, which, you know, in a democracy, that's just not right.
How do you define it? When you talk about fundamental rights, no democracy provides absolute fundamental rights. There's always a limitation on the fundamental rights that you're providing to your citizens, right? When it says liberty, it does not mean that you have the liberty to do just anything. You have to do things that are within the limits of society. Like, you can't just go out and murder someone because you have the liberty to do. It's difficult to define those limits.
I mean, see, the thing is, though, the harm principle does kind of define those limits in the sense that, you know, if you're actively talking about killing someone over and over again, then you could say that actually, yeah, you probably should be restricted and limited in your speech. If you're actively talking about physically harming someone, but, you know, if it's just being critical of them, that's absolutely allowed.
But then what do you take about situations like, for example, all modern democracies, they have protests, right?
Yeah.
And usually at these protests, you have a certain section of society which is protesting, which is causing an inconvenience to another section of society. So in that case, is there liberty or freedom to protest infringing upon someone else's freedom to have, a day that is unobstructed by such protests?
No, but okay, but what do you mean about, like, so your view is that the inconvenience is like what? Obstruction?
Like, for example, in India, if you look at India has cases where, and this is just to put a point across, not saying that I oppose this particular protest. Like, you had the farm protests in India. You must have heard about those farmer protests. You had the farmers blocking off some main highways of the leading up to the capital and all. And naturally, people were getting inconvenienced, or if not the highways, if I'm wrong, if not highways, they did block some urban roads. So it's causing inconvenience to people. Don't I have the liberty to not have to face that? People get stuck for hours because of such protests in traffic.
Right. So I think yeah, I do believe in authorized protest. Blocking off a highway is severe, but if you're just on a main street, for example, protesting, and then you inconvenience someone because, you know, now they can't get access to that street, then I think that's not a big deal. But I think in any democracy, you should be able to apply for permission to protest. And, you know, like, there should be very good reasons why that permission isn't granted. Now, if the government is actively not accepting any of your peaceful protests, then maybe blocking a highway may be justified because the government's repeatedly undermining your ability for a peaceful protest. But if the government does grant you the right to protest in a particular location, then you know, you've got your group who's protesting has the responsibility to make it peaceful. And when I say peaceful, I mean you chant your slogans and things like that, and that will inconvenience some people, but I think that inconvenience is justified in order to make sure that people get their point heard. But when it comes to things like the farm protesters in Extinction Rebellion, they definitely straddle the boundary of what I think is acceptable. I think what you need to do is you need to basically negotiate with those people and basically say, look, we'll grant you the ability for peaceful protests if and only if you kind of don't kind of make a nuisance of yourself, and you don't kind of tie yourself to a train or something like that in order to make a point. So I think there's that, there's rights and responsibilities on both parties. I also think as well, right, lockdown and coronavirus changes the equation somewhat, because then you could argue by the mere act of protesting, you are endangering people. Because you're helping spread a virus. So I think things get a bit different when granting authorization for protests during lockdown. It needs to be outdoors and people need to be maintaining a social distance. But even then, I think the government should probably increase the threshold for what's considered acceptable. So, like, for example, I thought it was ridiculous that, like, protests over the summer for, like, say, Black Lives Matter. So yes, maybe you could argue that the issue warrants a protest, and that's absolutely fine. But protests in Britain about someone being shot 4,000 miles away, in some cases quite hostile, quite sinister protests. I mean, is that really justified when it risks, kind of spreading the virus? Probably not. So, I think you have to kind of weigh these things carefully as a society. But I just feel like parties like the BJP go out of their way to suppress any criticism on media or any criticism in public. And to me, that's like a sign of quite an insecure government.
The point that remains, like you talked about the protests, like during COVID and all, the equation, as you said, changes. But in a normal circumstance, when a protest is authorized, do you think it is the responsibility because of the government, because it is giving the authorization for the protest to take place? They ensure that no inconvenience takes place to the happens for the other citizens, or are the protesters responsible for ensuring that?
Well, I think there's two things here. So I think the protesters are responsible for ensuring that no other parties get injured, but the police force needs to make a judgment in granting that authorization. They need to make a judgment about, well, what is the risk to other people getting harmed. So, like, to give you an example, occasionally in the UK and then in America as well, sometimes you might have like a group of anti-racist protesters and then some like white supremacist protesters, and then that's where the police have to make a very careful judgment. How much security are we going to provide to this venue? So there is still an obligation on the police to keep the wider public safe, and they have an absolute right to arrest any protesters who step out of line. So I think that's quite important. That's quite an important aspect of it. But I still think it's really important we protect that right to protest. But I do think I've taken part in a couple of protests in my time. I don't really always think it's a very useful form of activism. So whilst I'll defend the rights of people to protest, I don't really think it's always the most productive way. If your desire is social change, I don't necessarily think it's a very productive use of time.
Actually, I would have to agree as well. I mean, there are instances where protests have definitely worked out. Like India's independence was based entirely on protesting and talking about expressing your opinion.
Yeah, but, and it elicited a lot of sympathy within Britain as well.
Yeah, but there's always a but to this. In a modern democracy, I don't think it's effective anymore because the systems are in place. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect of he's considered to be the father of the Indian Constitution. He said in the Constituent Assembly that since we are creating this constitution, the methods of protests and all should not be of need to use them, because we are providing the provisions that are required for the citizens to be heard. So if the citizens are actually making use of the protests, then we have failed as a society. Right.